I worked on a case when I was with the Civil Rights Division that occurred in Alma, Georgia. Anyone ever been to Alma, Georgia? Okay. All right, it's not far from Waycross, Georgia. Probably that's where the trial was. Everyone ever been to Waycross? How about Savannah? All right, so it's not far from Savannah, Georgia, or Jacksonville, Florida. I remember those were the two airports we used to fly in and out of. And in that particular case, there were three young white men who had made it their practice they would frequently go into this public housing project occupied primarily by single African American women and their children, and they would go in and just sort of yell racial slurs and throw bottles. It's the early 1990s, maybe before many of you were born, and just generally being jerks. They were young. They were like 18, 19, 20 years old. And one night they were driving, and the housing development was sort of just as you rounded a bend and not far from the road. They were all driving in the cab of one guy's pickup truck, and one of the young men took a assault rifle and fired it indiscriminately out the window. Shots went into a duplex occupied by two families. One was a 64-year-old African-American woman. The other was about a mid-40s African-American woman and her two teenage daughters. Fortunately, no one was injured. There were bullets that went into the headboard of the 64-year-old woman's bed. The headboard was only about this high off the pillow. It was about 10 o'clock at night. She fortunately was not in bed at the time. In the other duplex, there were bullets that went through a lamp, a chair, and into the cinder block wall of one of the daughters' bedrooms. Again, fortunately, no one was injured. A stroke of luck, the hat of the shooter blew off during the shooting into the roadway. Turned out to be a key piece of evidence on down the road. And the case went unsolved essentially for 4 years because there frankly wasn't a lot of interest in local law enforcement and looking into it. Finally, the guy who was in the middle, you had the driver, the shooter, the guy in the middle, he was arrested on some other charges and decided he needed to help himself out, and so he told the arresting officers, I've got some information on this unsolved hate crime. Case ends up getting solved. He ends up being a witness at the trial. But one of the things we had to do in proving the racial motivation in that case was we looked into the history of all of the individuals. And the young man who was the driver and the owner of the assault rifle, and when I say we, and just this will be anytime a prosecutor says we, they really mean the law enforcement officers who did all the work, and then we just got to talk about it later. So the FBI agent on the case did a little digging into the young man, the driver's background, and found out he'd sort of been a problem in high school, and that the father had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan or the local Klan branch. And so he found this high school history teacher who recalled an incident where in the high school history class, their junior year, they were during, I think it was during February, during Black History Month, they had gone over a bunch of significant historical events in the Civil Rights era, and he had shown them the movie Mississippi Burning. How many of you have seen the movie Mississippi Burning? Which is about the murders of the three election voting rights workers in Mississippi in the 1960s. And in that case, so the three individuals are arrested for some sort of traffic violation, taken to jail, then released, escorted by the police to the outskirts of town where a mixed group of law enforcement, non-law enforcement murders them and buries them in an earthen dam. And the young man, after the movie, said to the teacher, or defendant said to the teacher, if you don't knock off this, and they used a racial slur, loving tolerance crap, then you're going to end up just like those dead, and use the N-word again, in Mississippi Burning. And so we thought that was pretty good evidence that he didn't like African Americans, and that he had a racial motivation that would help prove his racial motivation in the shooting that we had charged. So it was important to go back and look at things that the history of the subject. Now, just as an aside, when we got to trial in that case, and the teacher was my witness, I think he's one of the most nervous witnesses I've ever examined in my more than 20 years as a prosecutor, and he when he got on the stand, of course, it was very important for him to say exactly what the defendant had said to him and to use the racial slurs in court. Because it's one thing to say, the racial slurs obviously carry a much more powerful message than just saying, black or African American. And when he went to say, I said, what did he say? And he said, yeah, and he used the word black instead of the racial slurs. And I said, really, is that what he said? And he said, yeah, couldn't get him in court, this history teacher, to use the N-word. But it all, at least for the government, turned out well in the end. The individuals were convicted and sent to federal prison. So we're going to play a little game here called free speech versus true threats, because a lot of the cases that we work on at the federal level end up being threats cases. And one of the biggest challenges that we have is looking at whether the circumstances show that something is free speech, because in this country you're allowed to say a lot of really ugly things, and that's not against the law. You're protected by the First Amendment. And then whether something is a true threat. So what do we look at to see if it's free speech versus true threat? So the clarity of the threat. Does it put the listener or the recipient in fear of harm? The directness of the threat. Is it conditional? Manner of delivery. So, where is it delivered? So the example here, graffiti on your house or rantings on a website. Specificity of the threat. Is it targeted? When I was relatively new in our office, we had an incident where the local chapter of the NAACP was meeting in Idaho Falls, outside of the hotel that's right there by the falls, and someone went and put leaflets on all the car windows that had some really anti-black, anti-African American statements on them, some pretty ugly stuff. And the question was whether or not that was a threat. And ultimately we decided that it wasn't, because the leaflet was, it was unmistakably meant to bother. They knew who their audience was. They picked that night because they knew who was their meeting. But the leaflets went on every single car in the parking lot, and we decided it was going to be hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they were threatening African Americans. And the reaction of the recipient, and that's an important one. So, I'm going to put each of these up on true threats or protected speech. How is the Arabs are terrorists and shouldn't be allowed to live? True threat or protected speech? Protected speech. Protected speech. Who says true threat? All right, why do you think that's a true threat?
Sounds pretty bad.
Sounds pretty bad, right?
Allowed to live.
Yeah. Well, you could probably add some facts to this where it would be a true threat. In and of itself, probably, if someone, who maybe they're going to come, maybe you had someone who had the head covering on, you walk up to them and say, Arabs are terrorists and shouldn't be allowed to live, right in their face, then that might make it a true threat. Let's just say it's someone standing outside on the sidewalk. Probably not, right? How about this one? Yeah, I've edited this for you because I know this is a very sensitive argument or audience, and you've never heard that word before.
Very sensitive.
True threat.
True threat, yeah. You may see a pattern here too. How about this one? It's pretty specific. There's no conditions. It's going to be before the end of the week. Pretty clear what they mean by I'm going to make sure you see hell. How about this one? Protected speech. How about this one? N-word should all go back to Africa where they came from. Go home on your own or go home in a body bag. How many are going threat on this one? Yeah, I'm probably going threat on this one. Obviously you have to have a lot more facts than you just get on these simple statements. Right, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a couple of Idaho cases that it's actually the same set of facts that made important case law in the Ninth Circuit where we are. This one, United States versus Gilbert. This is an old case from even before I became a lawyer. December of 1980, a guy named Keith Gilbert, who was an avowed white supremacist, started sending racially derogatory correspondence to a woman named Susan Smith, who operated a North Idaho adoption agency. And at the time, she was attempting to place minority children. She had some minority children that she wanted to place in homes in North Idaho. And the derogatory and threatening correspondence that, and I put threatening in quotation marks because that will come in sort of later in the end, it was not anything that said, Susan Smith, you need to quit advocating on behalf of these minority children or I am going to kill you. It was nothing like that. It was envelopes sent directly to her name on it, that had these flyers in them that talked about how bad it was to mix races, that pointed out the number of crimes committed by African American men on a daily basis. There was one that had a tree with an individual who was dark-skinned and had an afro hanging from the tree. There were all sorts of negative things about African Americans and about mixed marriage. The word mongrel appeared several times. I used to bring copies of this, but the copies I've made are like such bad generation now you can't even tell what these were. So that's what he was sending to her. And again, and to give you a sense of the mindset of some of these guys, in the you can't make this up and we don't catch the smart ones world, he did include his return address. So he was charged, there were some other things he did, it was part of a bigger case. He was charged with a misdemeanor violation of the Fair Housing Act. It's a misdemeanor because it's a threat case, there was no actual act of violence. And the federal district court judge in Idaho dismissed it and said the connection between the activities of adoption agency and occupying a dwelling were just too remote. You can't do that. It's not a violation of the Fair Housing Act. You can't use this statute. The Court of Appeals reversed, and that Fair Housing Act is interpreted broadly. This is a significant case going forward for prosecutions under this statute, and said, as you can see here, the placement of minority children by the director of an adoption agency is a protected activity because the director is aiding or encouraging minorities in the occupancy of a dwelling. So the Ninth Circuit said, the information, they reinstated the information, which was the charging document, and sent it back to the trial court for trial. Mr. Gilbert went to trial and was convicted by a jury of his peers, or else the people they could get to show up there. I don't know how many of the rest of them were avowed white supremacists. And so the second time when he was convicted at trial, he alleged that the evidence was not sufficient to prove that he had threatened Ms. Smith because there was nothing specifically threatening about any one single mailing. And the Ninth Circuit said the threat should be considered in light of the entire factual context. You didn't have to look at each one individually, and you can look at it as well to see what was the reaction of Mrs. Smith, what evidence showed what her reaction was. And as you might imagine, she was pretty darn scared and felt threatened by receiving that correspondence from Mr. Gilbert. So again, very, very important for us in our threats cases, the Gilbert cases. So one of the things that's challenging about prosecuting hate crimes is that, and I think makes it important for us to prosecute them when we can as hate crimes, is that assaults motivated by hate or bias tend to be more violent than other assaults. And sometimes we hear, assault's an assault, they all do deserve to be prosecuted, which is true. I mean, if it's a criminal assault, it should be prosecuted, the person should be held accountable. But I think there is something different about hate crimes, about assaults or crimes that are motivated by the actual or perceived characteristic of the victim. And the particular viciousness of the assault, violence of the assault, tends to be particularly true for members of the LGBT community. And one of the other things that is challenging in these cases is most of the time the assailants and the victims don't know one another. And it's because the individuals are picked because of how they look or the perception of who they are, rather than because of any particular thing that they've said or done. So this case, United States versus Bullard, does anyone recognize where this is? Anyone here familiar with Nampa? All right, so this is the Walmart at 12th Avenue South in Nampa. And in the early morning hours of July 4th of 2008, a young man, African-American man, went into that Walmart to go into the dairy aisle to get some milk for his cereal. He had a job that he was getting ready to go to, or he'd just gotten up to go to work. He was followed in pretty quickly by 4 individuals, 3 men and a woman who had been partying at over in this apartment complex over here. They were not particularly fond of African American people, and as they went into the store behind the victim in this case, they started making comments about the fact that there was an African American in the store, and they made their purchase. They both happened to, they went out ahead of him. They were getting orange juice to go with their vodka. And they went out a little bit ahead of him. 3 of the woman who was with them, she took their purchase and went home. 2 of them stayed right inside here in this little entryway. The 3rd went into this row of cars. Now keep in mind, this is a lovely daylight picture. This incident happened in the middle of the night, just after midnight. And when the victim in the case came out of the store, the 2 men who were waiting near the entry, made comments to him, and then based on his race, and then signaled to their friend Mr. Bullard, who was waiting between the cars, as the victim walked out past the people who were not saying kind things, and then past Mr. Bullard. Mr. Bullard said to him the comment to the effect of, what country do you think you're in, suggesting that he ought not be in the United States. The victim in this case was born and raised in Caldwell, Idaho. And then he started chasing the victim across the parking lot, caught him right up in this area, this little sort of ditch area here, because the victim realized he was trapped and turned to face the guy who was chasing him. And then Mr. Bullard and his friends who came up with him beat the victim until he was unconscious. And then they left. One of their group decided that was enough. And they went back to the apartments and they bragged about what they had done. They all had girlfriends there. 2 of the women decided that they wanted to go check on the victim, and they told their boyfriends they were going to do something else. They went out and they found the victim. He had regained consciousness, couldn't find his car keys, couldn't find his glasses, and they actually gave him a ride back to his apartment so he could get his other set of keys. Of course, they did not tell him that they were the girlfriends of the assailants, but they turned out to be pretty important witnesses at the trial. We charged this case under the 18 U.S.C. 245. It's a great story about the work that was done by the Nampa Police Department to identify the individuals. Our victim in this case went to the Nampa Police the next day. He actually first went to the Caldwell Police. They told him you have to go to the Nampa Police. And the Nampa Police, he didn't know, the victim didn't know who had assaulted him. He didn't really get a great look at them. I mean, he was just minding his own business, had no idea this was going to occur. So would anyone here have any ideas about what the police did in order to track down the assailants here? Step 1? Cameras. We got the surveillance videotape at Walmart. And in order to get that, they needed to know what time the event had occurred. And the victim in this case was off a little bit on his time. He wasn't, I guess, totally keeping track of the time. And it took the detective from the Nampa Police Department, a guy named Jason Kimball, had to go back and get 2 sets of tape and go through literally hours and hours of surveillance tape until he finally noticed there was this group, the folks who ended up being our defendant, who appeared to be sort of tracking our victim through the store. He was able to get video of them coming out through the checkout aisle. They showed give me the orange juice to the girl and she leaves, them sort of pausing in the entryway. And then there's a very grainy video or surveillance video of the chase through the parking lot, where you really can't tell who anyone is, although you can tell like their little dots running through the parking lot because the cameras there are up in the light poles for the parking lot. And the Nampa Police put this information out on their, through their network of informants, and ultimately identify our defendants as Michael Bullard, Richard Armstrong, and a guy named James Whitewater. So those 3 individuals, we end up prosecuting all 3. James Whitewater agrees to cooperate and testify against his colleagues. He was, based on the evidence we were sort of able to gather, we guess that he was probably the least involved. Does that name James Whitewater ring a bell for anyone? Well, in the it's a sad story for Mr. Whitewater and others he associates with. He served a substantial amount of time in federal prison. He served about 3 years, and then he was released. And after you're released from federal prison, you're on what's called supervised release, which is sort of probation after your sentence in the federal system. And Mr. Whitewater, within weeks of successfully finishing supervised release, participated in the murder of a man out in Canyon County. It was a fair amount of information about it in the news. The murder victim had assaulted a woman. Whitewater and others didn't like that and killed the man. He recently pled guilty, so unfortunately didn't learn his lesson. Whitewater did from this, still participating in a lot of violent activities.